Hi, today we'll talk about some of the components of skill-related fitness, which are stability and balance, which includes balance and balance exercises, coordination, reaction time, and finally, we'll analyze how we move from point A to point B, the human gait. Before we talk about the types of balance and balance issues, let's define the term of stability because we've talked about balance a little bit, but generally stability used as if it's balance, but it's not really balance. Stability is the ability to resist the disruption of that balanced state. So if you remember this guy who's trying to balance work and life, he's got some balance. It's because the system is constantly in motion. This is a dynamic balance situation. Is he stable? He has the balance. He's not falling off. He still keeps it. But is he stable? Is the question. So there is this constant action, constant moving going on in the system, but he is not very stable. Why? Because he can't really resist and keep the system stable. Therefore, by definition, he has the dynamic balance, but he's not really stable. The girl, on the other hand, since there is no movement involved, that's static balance, that's okay. But she has also stability. She is able to resist any kind of disruption to this position. If I push her in that position, imagine I'm pushing this guy with, let's say, 100 newtons of force just from the pecs or from the back. Probably he's gonna fall off. So his resistance to keep the stability is low. Now imagine the same thing. I'm gonna push the girl with same amount of force, let's say 100 newtons, which is not very much, not very high. Is she going to fall off? Probably not. Therefore, by definition, she has more stability than this guy. So it's your ability to keep that balanced position is called stability. The more stable you are, the more you are resistive to the forces that try to disrupt your state of balance. Stability is the ability to resist the outside forces to disrupt your ability of balance. And there are some factors that affects the stability right away. The first one is the height. If you're a tall person, because your center of mass is normally, as a consequence of being tall, is high, you're gonna have less stability with the same base of support. Two guys, one is shorter, one is taller. Uh, let's imagine they both have the similar or same base of support. The guy with the shorter stature will have more stability. Why? Because center of mass is lower, that creates lower moment arms. Therefore, it's much harder for him to get out of that base of support, if you remember the cone of stability. So it's much easier to keep the posture stable. The second one is the width of your base of support. Wider it is, more wiggle room for you to play around, if you remember the cone of stability. If it's narrow, there's not much wiggle room for you to play. Imagine you're just standing on one leg. Your base of support is just your one foot. So if you try to move around and carry your center of mass outside of the cone of stability, you're gonna fall off. Whereas with the legs open wide with a super wide stance, this is your base of support, and then your cone of stability will be much wider. Therefore, you're gonna have much more wiggle room to play, and then by definition you're going to be more stable. And the last factor that affects stability is obviously the contact surfaces. If it's ice, even with the wider base of support, you might have less stability. If it's like Bosu ball, something that is moving, not something that is not compliant, like rocky surfaces and so on. So the stability will change with the contact surfaces, supporting surface. If it's something not solid, something doesn't have friction, you will have less stability, obviously. What is the most stable position for human beings? The wider you are, the more limbs you use, the more stable you're going to be. The lower your center of mass, the more stable you're going to be. Therefore, the quadruped position, if we check here, is the most stable position to be in. It's not always the most athletic one, but that's the most stable position we're going to have. Open your legs as wide as you can, open your arms almost as wide as you can with the bent elbows, obviously, you're going to have the most stable position that a human being can achieve. If you want to go towards the less stable but more agile version, I would say, you're going to have what we call as the triple contact here. It's used in the beginning of a sprint start, and then the wider stand position, which is kind of like the defensive stance that the basketball players use, and then the typical shoulder width apart, and then the narrow stance, which is the less stable one. We learned that we keep our balance as long as we keep our center of masses within the cone of stability. The moment it goes out, we lose the balance. But what are the types of stances that we can use as a human being? We have the unilateral, which is on one leg, which we have the tandem stance, which is 2 feet aligned, and we have the bilateral stance, which is using 2 feet planted firmly on the ground. Let's go ahead and check the unilateral ones. As the name implies, unilateral means just using one foot to keep our balance. It's actually an important distinction to make, because if you notice that any kind of change of direction or jumping generally happens on one leg. That's why I really like to use single leg exercises, especially with the team athletes. If you think about it, even with the layup or with the high jump or with the long jump, we always use one side of the body instead of using the two sides. The volleyball smash, you run and smash in some cases. So unilateral exercises like the pistol squat is quite an advanced one. But one of my favorite would be the rear foot elevated split squat, or the fancy version is called the Bulgarian split squat. It's great because you kind of isolate one leg, like I told you, especially with the team sport athletes, kicking in soccer. What's happening? It's actually happening at one joint. So force production is separately happening on two different joints. The squats are great. For instance, bilateral exercises, they're great to use to build the overall maximal strength. But when it comes to a sport-specific kind of exercise, I really like the single leg stuff, maybe a little bit more so than the bilateral stuff. Why? Because you want to transfer those strength gains to your sport, to your athletic skill. Imagine the high-level technical skill of sprinting. What's happening? Is it bilateral force production? Do we use our legs at the same time to propel the body forwards? Nope. So it's left, right, and so on. We're producing forces unilaterally. That unilateral force production requires unilateral exercises to be integrated into the program. This is actually kind of a big discussion going on right now. Which exercises transfers better to athletic skills? This is an exciting area of research, unilateral compared to bilateral exercises. And we need a lot of studies to actually conclude that which one is superior to the other. But in my experience, generally speaking, as far as I've seen, anecdotally speaking, unilateral exercises seem to work, because I work with professional soccer players. In my experience, we've done the squats, obviously. I'm not saying that they're bad, but I would prefer, especially in the maintenance level, especially in season time, unilateral stuff seems to work a little bit better than the bilateral stuff. Moving on without getting stuck with the strength exercises, the tandem is the other type of stance that we can have. Probably you've seen this one on walking on slack lines, or the circus act where you hold this long stick and try to walk on that line. It's one foot aligned in front of the other. That's not really a stable position. That's definitely not the most stable position we can have, but it's a stance that we can use. The last stance, as we talk about, is the bilateral one. Well, we can use the wide stance, we can use a narrow stance to keep our balances, but there's one variation which is kind of important because of its use activates the bigger muscle groups. It's an important movement pattern, which we call the lunge movement pattern. Notice that it's not a tandem stance. With the lunge, our feet are not aligned in front of the other. It's a step forward and then squatting down into that position, the lunge balance stance. Obviously, the types of surfaces will change the way we keep our balances. If it's a compliant surface, like if you're wearing the cleats on grass surfaces, That's a very compliant, very stable surface. Whereas if you're on unstable surface like ice or a Bosu ball, that's not gonna be compliant, and you're gonna have hard time to keep your balance. So different types of surfaces like compliant, non-compliant, and unstable will obviously change the way you keep your balance. The most stable one is the compliant one. Let's check some examples of different types of surfaces and the balance stances that are used in those pictures. So there's this guy walking on a pipe or a line. Is this a compliant, uncompliant, or unstable surface? Since it's not moving, that's a compliant surface. It's a hard surface. That's a compliant surface, and he is using a tandem stance to walk on that line. Next one. Here's a guy walking on a slack line, and this slack line is definitely non-compliant. It's moving all the time, so that surface is unstable. Again, he's using a tandem stance to walk on that slack line. What about wet basketball court? Normally, basketball court is a hard surface. It's not very slippery, but it's wet when it's wet. Now it's not compliant. It's definitely an uncompliant surface. You might even call it unstable, depending on where you're stepping on it. So a wet basketball court is an unstable surface. And the guy doing squats on a Bosu ball, which looks like this. As you can see, there are a lot of things going wrong in here. A lot of spinal flexion, posterior pelvic tilt. That shaking, that different position with the feet is putting a lot of stress interiorly or medially on the ligaments of the knee, and it's loaded. That's not really a smart thing to do, actually. But still, this is an exercise that is done on unstable surfaces. If you need that kind of unstable exercises, by all means, you should do it. But I doubt this guy is working on unstable surfaces, or an athlete requires unstable surfaces. After defining the types of stances that we use to keep our balances, let's go ahead and classify the type of balance exercises that we can use. Starting with the static one. With the static exercises, your center of mass does not move much. It shouldn't be moving. Your base of support is fixed, and your center of mass does not have this wider oscillation, does not have this sway around. When you have the sway, we're gonna call it semi-dynamic kind of balance exercises. With the static one, the classic examples would be the yoga poses or planks where you hold this isometric contraction, where you keep the body in the static position. A great example of a semi-dynamic balance exercise is the single-legged Romanian deadlift. It's a pretty long name. With this one, your center of mass is not moving too much. Your base of support is stable and on one foot. So there is this little bit of sway, but it's not too much. Our base of support does not change position. That's the key. When we go to the dynamic ones, you're going to see that with the dynamics balance exercises, whole base of support will move from one point to the other. So an exercise like side to side single leg hops will be a great example of dynamic balance exercises. Why? Base of support, the single leg, moving from one side to the other and try to stabilize there. Jumping, boom, standing there, keeping the balance, and then jumping back to the other side. With each hop, there is an element of balance because you have to balance yourself and then push yourself to the other side. Dynamic balance exercise. The last type of balance exercises is the functional type of balance exercises. Well, the word functional is really becoming popular in the fitness industry. It becomes a way of making money. But like I told you in the mobility example, the difference between mobility and flexibility, functional means whatever exercise you do, it should serve a certain purpose. Say if you're doing a balance exercise like the side hops, it's a dynamic exercise. If you do it in a way that it serves the sport of, say, skating, now it's not only dynamic, it's functional balance exercise. Let's watch an example and try to understand it better. So we might call it as this is actually a semi-dynamic kind of balance exercise. Since he's doing this one for the sport of tennis, this is a functional type of balance exercise. It's semi-dynamic. Why? Because base of support does not move too much. He's trying to keep the base of support and try to keep that static position, but again try to hit the ball, which makes it a functional balance exercise. Now the question here would be, as a tennis player, do you really need the unstable kind of environment? Is your ground shaking, moving like this one? In my opinion, it's a no. So this kind of exercises or this kind of equipment is mostly marketing. Yes, it's a dynamic balance exercise, but we can question the transfer of that exercise to the actual performance of the sport of tennis. Well, the next topic is coordination, the ability of coordination. Well, it's an ability to sequentially perform one move after the other with control, without effort, smoothly. Like in the example of weightlifting, a lot of stuff has to happen at the same time, or a lot of them has to happen sequentially. You have to lift off the ground, wait for the right moment, and then extend, triple extend, and then get under the bar, and so on. There's an element of sequentially activating all of those movements, all of those muscles, and it requires high levels of coordination. A similar example would be, say, a basketball layup. There is a sequential of movements that you have to perform. Tennis serve, similar stuff. The forehand stroke in table tennis, similar stuff. It has to happen sequentially so that you have the right technique. Actually, all of those examples I gave you was the examples of gross motor skills. It doesn't require small adjustments to be made. We activate our larger muscle groups to be able to perform those movements. Windsurfing or freestyle discipline of windsurfing requires incredible amount of coordination because you have so limited amount of time to perform the movements. Here's Sarakita. She makes it look super easy, but you can't really imagine how difficult this is. This stuff happens when you spend years on the board, when you spend the right amount of years at the right time, starting from the childhood, and then this level is actually can be achieved. This much amount of time, but still you have to perform all of them right away so that you can actually be able to pull off the moves that you can do. Coordination is an ability, it's a learned skill. It doesn't come from the birth right away. I mean, you might be born with a high potential of learning those skills, or a talent with learning those skills, but still you have to practice them. So the coordination is a learned skill. Some people, they might learn it fast, some people takes a little bit longer, but still you have to spend certain amount of time to get this coordination going. Sarikita, she wasn't born with the ability to pull off the moves right away. She had to practice on them, years even. And like I told you, probably with the coordination, if you remember the neuroplasticity, we have this certain amount of window. Our brains are high in neuroplasticity, which is great environment for learning stuff, which is great for practicing skills that requires coordination. If you're not using your bigger muscle groups to perform the movements, you're using fine motor skills, say like you handwriting or a surgeon performing a surgery. These are all activities, these are all movements that require fine motor skills. The adjustments we make are much smaller compared to the gross motor skills. And the final type of skill that requires relatively higher levels of coordination is the hand-eye skills. For that skill to work, we have to perceive something on the outer world with our eyes and then send a signal to our hand so that we can react to it. Say playing a tennis and then hitting the ball, that will require hand-eye coordination skills. Or a receiver trying to wait for the ball and catch it at the right time is using his hand-eye coordination skills. The next skill is the reaction time, or being able to respond to an outer stimulus as fast as we can. The faster our reaction time is, the better our ability to react. A typical example would be a sprinter in the blocks, hearing the gunshot and then exploding off the blocks, reacting to the audio signal. Here we're going to see an example of choice reaction time, where we have multiple choices to choose from and then react. This is a goalkeeper, professional goalkeeper practicing. With the sprinter in the blocks, the signal was audio. Here it's visual. We have to see, the goalkeeper has to see and react. This one is called the choice reaction time, and it's actually much slower than a single reaction time. If it were just one choice and then he has to react to that one right away, it would have been much faster. But because he has different choices, his reaction times are much slower. Another example of choice reaction time, a soccer player receiving the ball and then he has to react to the light right away. This is kind of a new training technique for soccer teams. So it's the green light here, he has to send it here, receive the ball, green light. All of those lights, yeah, this one we couldn't see it. So as the light turns on, he has to pass the ball in that square. Choice reaction time as fast as he can. Receive, where's the light here? He has to send it here. Receive here. That was pretty slow. Now we are moving on to an important topic, the human gait. How we move, what kind of strategies we use from moving from point A to point B. What's happening during those stages? What's the best strategy to use in terms of moving, in terms of efficiency from moving point A to point B? The human gait. All animals have a tendency to move from one place to the other. We humans as animals, if we use our limbs to move from one place to the other, we're going to call this the human gait. There will be different strategies of moving. There might be different strategies of moving. Walking is a form of human gait, walking gait, or running might be a form of human gait. All of those strategies, slithering is a form of gait used by the snakes, or galloping is a form of gait that is used by the horses. So humans use different strategies and we're going to call all of them the human gait. Since we use our feet to move around, since we can stand up, unlike many of the other animals, humans are bipedal, meaning they use their feet to move around, whereas the horses, for instance, they are quadrupedal because they are using 4 of their legs to move around. Also, our walking gait has 2 very distinct phases. That's why we call it biphasic. So human walking gait is bipedal and biphasic. There are 5 natural gaits that we can use to move from one place to the other. If we count them with increasing speed, the first one is walking. We use it. It's our most natural way of moving around. As we speed up, now it's going to be jogging. There's a huge difference between obviously walking gait and jogging gait. Jogging is the slowest form of running. And then as we get faster, now we can actually skip on one leg to move around. If we can speed up a little bit more, now we're going to start running. Think it as the middle distance kind of running. And if we go full speed, this will call sprinting. Notice that and keep in mind that there is a huge difference between sprint gait and the running gait or jogging gait. There is even a big difference between running and jogging. People think it's more or less the same thing. Oh, I just run a little bit faster and it's running. I'm okay. Slow running is jogging. I run a little bit faster. Now I'm running, and then I run at with my fastest speed. Now I'm sprinting. The technical differences between the sprinting gait and the running gait or jogging gait is incredibly huge. A gait cycle should involve two steps, or as we call it, one stride. A stride is two steps taken, which actually is called the gait cycle. Gait cycle and the stride, a human stride, is the same thing. There are a couple of terms that we need to learn to describe the human gait. The first one is the stride duration. It's the time that it takes when you complete the whole cycle of the gait. So one step and then two step, how long does it take? That's the stride duration. Stride length, on the other hand, the distance you cover with two steps, that's the stride length. Cadence, which is actually important in many sports like race walking or cycling, is the number of steps you take per minute. That's called the cadence. In race walking, if you know the race walk, they're not allowed to run, or at any time of the walk, one foot should make contact with the ground. That's called the race walking. It's incredibly important for them to check how many steps they're taking in 1 minute, and this is called the cadence. Same idea with the cycling. They really need to check the number of revolutions they're making, which is called the revolutions per minute, also called the cadence. So number of cadence, number of revolutions, or number of steps taken per minute is called the cadence. Imagine you are cycling. Why don't they check the speed and instead they check the cadence, right? They have all of the systems. They have the GPS systems, cyclists. Instead, they check the cadence. Why? Because sometimes they're climbing uphill. If you check the speed as a measurement of performance, since you're climbing really high uphills, for instance, your speed will be really low. But that's your maximum speed you can go actually, because it's really high. How are you going to measure the performance? With the cadence. You switch gears and the cadence stays the same. If you take a look at the professional cyclists, the cadence they use is generally similar. No matter if they go downhill or uphill, it doesn't matter. They check the cadence instead of the speed of the bike. Now we're going to analyze the human walking gait. Keep in mind that every one of us, if we don't have any abnormalities, even with the walking gait or any kind of gait for that matter, we're going to have a very distinct style. So all of us are very unique in that sense, like the thumb, like the iris of the eye. Even just the little things that it doesn't necessarily be unhealthy, but we have our styles, we have our anatomies, which is all different. We can be healthy, but still we all have kind of unique walking patterns, movement patterns involving any kind of human gait. For those of you who doesn't know what race walking looks like, that's a very typical, distinct kind of walking gait. It's not the natural walking gait that we use. It requires a special technique to be used. It requires special coordination, as you can see. But the key here is there's there's always contact with the ground. There's no flight time, as we call it in running. Like I mentioned earlier, the human gait has two very distinct phases. That's why the walking gait is biphasic. But if we analyze it, we're going to see that actually there are 8 different phases, 3 of them belonging to one phase and 5 of them belonging to one phase. So all in all, we're going to have 8 phases of the human walking gait. So the first phase, maybe not the first phase, but the moment is called the initial contact, where we touch our heel to the ground and the double limb support starts. So since both of our feet are on the ground, our weight is supported by both of our feet, which is called the double limb support. Ideally, we want to make contact with the heel first, but that's not always the case, and that's not always abnormal. Second phase is called loading response, and as you can see here, so initial contact, and the moment the other foot lifts off the ground, we're going to call this the loading response. So let's check one more time. Initial contact, just the 10%, it happens super fast. When we analyze the human gait, don't forget that we always analyze just one foot, one limb. So it's actually 16 phases happening, but for each leg there are 8 separate phases. So initial contact, loading response, check the other foot, initial contact, loading response, finished. It's just the first 10% of the walking gait. Next phase is called the mid stance, and it's the longest phase of the walking gait. It starts when the loading response finishes here, and then that whole period where the weight of the body is carried on just one limb only is called the mid stance. Let's check one more time. Loading response, mid stance, and then it finishes. Terminal stance starts with when the heel lifts off the ground, signaling that the stance phase will be almost over. We're going to start swinging the leg. So the moment your heel comes off the ground and then your other leg finishes the swing, that's the terminal stance. We check here. So terminal stance finishes. Check the right foot. Terminal stance starts and finishes. So let's check one more time. Here and finished. There's a transitional phase between the swing and the stance phase, and it's the fifth phase, which is called the pre-swing. As we lift our heel off the ground with the terminal stance, now we're going to move the weight forward, getting ready to swing. This stance is a very small one. It's called pre-swing phase. The moment your foot comes off the ground, you're not in the stance phases anymore. Now you're in the swinging phase. And the first phase of the swinging phase is called the initial swing, which we swing the leg forward and transfer the weight forward. Last two phases of the swinging period is the mid swing and the terminal swing, where we carry our foot from where we swing our foot from the initial swing till the heel touches to the ground. So initial swing starts, the foot clearance is there, we swing our foot, and the moment it touches, initial, mid, and the terminal swing. Let's check the example here. Let's check here. Initial swing, middle swing, and then the terminal swing. One more time. Initial, mid, and the terminal. The distinction between the phases comes from the tibia, actually. If the tibia is vertical, so initial, mid, this is the terminal swing. The moment the tibia is 90 degrees, that's where the terminal swing starts. So one more time. Terminal starts here and then finishes when the heel touches the ground. Why are we analyzing the human gait in so many detailed phases? Well, because in every one of those phases has a distinct character, and anything goes wrong in that phase will have a different name. Abnormal gaits are beyond the scope of this lesson, actually, and there are many of them. But to show you some examples, let's watch a couple of them. This is called the stoppage gait, and it happens when there's a problem with the swinging phase. There's probably paralysis of the swinging leg, and then there will be a slapping, which is also called the slapping gait on the ground.
Steppage gait or drop foot gait. As mentioned previously, weakness of the foot and ankle dorsiflexors results in a foot slap gait. However, if there is total paralysis of the foot and ankle dorsiflexors, the leg is brought up higher off the ground than normal by flexing the ipsilateral hip and knee so that the toes of the foot will not scrape the ground during the swing phase. This is known as the steppage gait or drop foot gait, which is the swing phase abnormality in a patient with paralysis of the foot and ankle dorsiflexors.
Let's watch another example of a swinging phase abnormality, which is called the Trendelenburg gait, which is also very characteristic with the hip drop during the swing phase.
Just gonna film you walk if that's okay, just for educational purposes. No, it's good. Yeah.
You can see on the right side that the hip is dropping during the swing phase. That's also a pretty common kind of gait amongst the seniors. The antalgic gait that happens to all of us at some point in our lives when we have some sort of pain in our limbs, we have to compensate it with a shorter stride during the swing phase. The last abnormality we're going to check today is called the hemiplegic gait, when there's no clearance of the foot during the swing phase, when there's no flexion at the knee. Let's check it. You can see that there's a problem with the clearance. The foot is scraping the floor. When we're analyzing the walking gait, there are certain guidelines that we can use. Let's check them. Let's analyze this person and then start to try to see his weaknesses, what's happening. The first one is we should check are the steps symmetrical? Is there a circumduction rotation at the legs? As you can see, there is a rotation at the leg. Or is there a hip drop happening? As you can see, there's the big hip drop on the left side. Are the shoulders level? We can't really tell from the sagittal view because we're on the side now during his walk. We should also check the head and neck position. The hip drop will also affect the head position as well. And then we can check the arm swings if they're symmetrical or not. A lot of information with today's video. We talk about the stability, balance, and types of stances, exercises, and surfaces for balance. We've also learned about coordination and reaction time. Finally, we've learned about the human gait and its properties and analyzed the phases of the walking gait. So see you on the next lesson with the topic of movement across the lifespan.